Morning, everybody. I have a few gizmos that I need to mind here. These things, they run us, not the other way around. So my name is Dan Klyn. I'm an information architect from Michigan, and I'm very glad to have the opportunity to speak with you all today. And I'm especially glad for the opportunity that Simon gave me by asking me a question. Oftentimes, people just turn me loose, and left to my own devices, I will just talk about what I always talk about, which is architecture and the work of two architects in particular, Richard Saul Wurman, who invented the TED conference, you may know him from that, and Christopher Alexander. And so when Simon asked me for this talk to consider this question, what is the thing that will realize people like us who do what we do here and now, that the future will thank us for, that was a gift that I grappled with, and the answer that I came up with is based on the work of Richard Saul Wurman and Christopher Alexander. So there was a little opportunity there for me to talk about something different, but I'm going to have to keep talking about this. So my answer to Simon's question is a little bit skeptical. And partially this might have to do with I live in the United States, and what's in the air right now in the United States is not optimism. So maybe that's behind my answer to Simon's question. But it's also a sense of history. This is a picture of Richard Saul Wurman in 1970 at the International Design Conference in Aspen. Unlike today, when there are a million conferences that designers can go to, and lots of sort of nested communities of practice, back in the 60s, this was the one gathering that all of the designers in the world would come to talk about the kinds of things that we're talking about here today. How do we use design to get to a better future? And the kinds of realizations that we would have that the future would thank us for, the ones that I've brought you today, are already realizations that have been had and ignored. In 1976, Richard Saul Wurman was the chairman of the conference at the American Institute of Architects. So all of the architects in the United States get together for a conference once a year. And by that time, by 1976, he had pretty much given up on trying to change culture through communities of practice. And instead of giving a direct message to his community of practice, the architects in the United States, he gave an indirect message to them that my research indicates nobody paid attention to. Instead of closing the conference with a keynote address, giving people specific instructions, he closed the conference with a keynote fable. And fables have an odd way of working on us, kind of the way that Jesus used parables to talk to an audience in one's own time, but with sort of an ear and an eye toward that story taking a little bit of time to unwind. So this is a picture of the little booklet, just like we all got a booklet today. The attendees at this conference in 1976 got a booklet with this fable, and it was called What If Could Be, an historical fable about the future. And the main character in this fable is a little fat guy with a beard who goes around telling people things they don't want to hear, which was a very thinly veiled self-reference by Richard Saul Wurman to himself. And the commissioner of curiosity and imagination, this little guy went around talking to the people in the city, trying to figure out what was going on in the city. And when he talked to a policeman, the policeman would talk about all of the problems with crime in the city, and the solutions that the policeman was able to offer were only on the basis of more. More policemen, more nightsticks, more CCTV cameras, more prisons, more. And he would talk with the teachers about the problems in the schools. And same thing, what do the teachers have as solutions to these problems? More classrooms, more curriculum committees, more pencils, more chairs, more overhead projectors. And on it went. And ultimately, the Commissioner of Curiosity comes to a depressing realization that nobody in this city is ever going to be able to change in the way that they need to change, because the only mode that they have, the only answer that they have is more. And any of you who work in a corporate environment, up and to the right, the doctrine of more is how we've gotten into the mess that we've gotten ourselves into today. And I was at another conference not too long ago, and I saw a presentation by this man, Dr. Jeffrey West, who is a physicist at the Santa Fe Institute in the United States, an institute that's interested in studying complexity. And he has used mathematics to study the things that people do, looking for mega sort of high-level patterns in the things that people do. And what this chart behind Jeffrey West shows is income growth, gross domestic product growth, crime growth, and the growth of patents, all plotted at once. And all of these things that people do seem to have this pattern that West calls superlinear scaling. Linear scaling would be when you double the size of something, you get twice as much of the something. That is not the pattern that we're talking about here with the things that people do. Superlinear scaling, and he calls this a universal set of scaling rules. Universally, he says that the things that people do tend to have a growth pattern that's more like this. The hockey stick shape of a growth pattern that just grows and grows, it's unbounded, and each time that you double the size of something, you get 15% more than twice as much of it. Twice the size, 215% of whatever it is that you're growing, and that this is the pattern that we are all locked into, superlinear scaling. And that's great. We all love the effects of superlinear scaling, but what West says is that this pattern has a problem built into it that you cannot get away from. This superlinear scaling pattern will always end in a collapse, what he calls a finite time singularity. You can only wring an extra sort of free 15% out of doubling something so long until that process bottoms out and it collapses. And so what do? What we do is we innovate. And in order to continue the unbounded growth pattern that corporations demand, you need to come up with an innovation to push the singularity forward in time. And the wicked game that this sets up, this is where we live today, is each time that you do one of those innovations, each time that you shift the paradigm and push the singularity further out into the future, you have to do that again. And then you have to also do it again. And each time that you do this, the interval between the last innovation and the next innovation to avoid the collapse, the interval gets shorter every time. And this leads to, this is why we can't have nice things. The pace of this is completely inhumane, and the side effects of this are all over the place. It's just that people like us, we're a bit further away from the exhaust of this process. We're willing to allow other people to live in the exhaust of this process. So how might we get out of this mess? If only there were a book that you could follow, a simple book that you could read that could help you get out of any mess. If only there were a discipline devoted to making complex things clear. So as you may have expected, I'm going to talk about the information architecture of this problem using some of the ideas from Abby Covert's book and this model of what is information architecture to try to describe what this problem is, to do an as-is analysis of the information architecture of this death spiral that we're in, and then posit a different way. So the information architecture of this mess, it starts with, and any information architecture can be described in terms of meaning at the core, the arrangement of things relative to that meaning, and then the choreography that gets set up, what we do in response to meaning and arrangement. And so at the root of this problem, as far as I'm concerned, is what I'll call the Cartesian model of space, where the answer to anything is it depends. This has crept into, this is now the cosmology that we all live inside of. This is a manuscript by Christopher Alexander from back in 1981. Here he says, what is a cosmology? Cosmology is the most basic picture a person has in their mind of what kind of place the world is, what its structure is, and what your own relationship to this world might be. And ever since the time of Descartes, ever since the 17th century, we've had a picture of the world that has been bifurcated, that has been split into the real things of matter and stuff and the pretend things of spirit and the soul. And this cosmology of it depends breaks up the world into a grid. And the way that you understand the world inside of this cosmology is to throw the grid over the world and to start inspecting each of the little squares. And by understanding each of the little bits, you then build out a comprehensive world picture. And this contributes to, I believe this is at the root of our pattern of eventual extinction if we don't keep innovating faster and faster. Because this cosmology says that nothing's special. Anywhere in the grid is as good as anywhere else. Margaret Wertheim said, on the level playing field of Cartesian cosmology, we are nowhere special. The very definition of relativistic space guarantees there is no place special to be. And so, why not arrange things for that dumb doubling? Every time that you double the size of something, you get 15% profit. The way to keep doing that is to adopt a cosmology where one use is as good as another, one life is as good as another, if the price is right. An industrial doctrine of the interchangeability of parts. So that's the root of it. Space is neutral. Material is just stuff. If there is spirit or soul, that's a matter for you and your funny religion. And there really isn't a fixed meaning. What things mean is, well, it depends. It depends what square of the grid we're talking about. And so naturally, it's not wrong for us, if that's the cosmology, for us to be optimizing, to be arranging things when we make choices about putting things together, that the way that we arrange is on the basis of the assembly of parts, and to keep feeding that unbounded superlinear growth. And unfortunately, part and parcel of that, when we arrange on the basis of it depends, is we need to preserve the flexibility to change what we mean when we say what we say. We might need to pivot our product and service in a radical new direction in order to keep innovating. And so the wiggly bits, the things that don't fit in the grid get chopped off. And the way that we arrange things is toward an infinite number of combinations of parts on the basis of it depends. Some of you may know the work of Jeff Patton, the story mapping guy. This is a picture that he drew for me at breakfast a couple of weeks ago. He likes to say he works with product teams to help them make good products. And he observes to product teams that we all think we're in the cow business, but really I'm on the flank steak team, and you're on the rump roast team, sorry. And we're expected to make a cow. We're expected to make something living through the assembly of parts. And sometimes that doesn't work. Oftentimes it doesn't work. And so we've got complementary methods and practices in digital, in the kinds of things that we do. Given that there's really no fundamental meaning, it's really it depends. Given that space is neutral and we want to arrange things in a way that can be rearranged as many ways as possible for our convenience, there are some methods and practices that we do that reify those patterns, that contribute to this problem, I believe. And so back to Simon's question, what are we going to realize here and now that the future will thank us for? How do we get unstuck from these patterns? Oftentimes when I get stuck, I like to use this tool from 1975. It was built by Brian Eno and Peter Schmidt, and it's called Oblique Strategies. And it's a deck of cards. The things that these cards say are often uncomfortable if you were to implement them as a strategy. That's why they're oblique strategies. And I think what we need to do is to discard some of the axioms that govern our work in digital. I think that's the realization is what has become axiomatic in our field that isn't true. Because that's what axioms are. They operate like the truth, but they're not the truth. They're a structure that has sort of calcified in a way of doing. They're accepted, they're established, they are self-evidencing, and I think we need to get rid of a couple of these, two of them in particular. And the first one is form follows function, which many of the most severe examples of work built on the basis of form follows function comes from European modernism, but that way of saying often gets traced back to the American architect Louis Sullivan. And what this has come to mean, this has become mantra, dogma in our ways of doing. What is digital product design? It's an imprecise, iterative process to solve a functional problem with a formal solution. What is design success? What is the ladder that you climb to succeed doing design? The first rung, according to this axiom, is function. That you start with something that functions, and then you make it usable. How those could ever be separate, you got me. Eventually, you could get to comfortable or delightful or meaningful, but we'll probably pivot a few times before we get there. Agile software development, Kanban, Lean, all of these things are based on the axiom that form ever follows function. Figure out the function, and then what's hard? You make the least amount of stuff that does that function. Which is why we can't have nice things. Because the kinds of functions, once they make it through the bifurcated double diamond process in all of our different disciplines and job titles, once it gets through the sausage works, a world based on function boils down to a fairly impoverished set of ways of doing, ways of arranging, especially if they all need to endlessly be pivotable into some other form when the function changes. And just like the Commissioner of Curiosity observed, when all we do is more, we're starting to now see what is the end of the line when you say form follows function. Facebook has been form following functioning endlessly, and it's gotten to the point where they now do not understand how it works. It's making its own form. The algorithms, the artificially intelligent processes that govern the presentation of form are functioning now on their own, which is scary. And Zuck's got nothing for us except more of this. So form follows function is bad for us, and I think that is an axiom. It is not the truth, and that we would do well to discard that as an axiom. I think it pairs awfully well with another axiom that will be harder for you to perhaps to entertain letting go of, but I'm going to suggest it anyway. You are not your user. The combination of form follows function, weaponized along with the axiom of you are not your user, creates conditions under which it's easy to make things that are bad for us. We put people into laboratories. We use our Cartesian world model of break up the user into the littlest bits possible, and then we'll figure out functionally based on, it ain't us, we're not going to use this thing, but that poor lady has to, and so we're going to break her up into little bits. What are all the things that she wants, and then systematically we'll try to force those bits in with the other bits that we already have. We use increasingly narrower lenses because you are not your user, because of the other is so unknowable. Explode her into bits and then examine all of the little bits. Like, where do her eyes go, even? And this mode is like the mode of a spotlight. We focus it on that bit, and everything else in the room isn't there. And this is why our process looks the way that it does. We'll take a little thin slice off of that cow, the thing we're going to work on, the most valuable version, the smallest version of value. And because you are not your user, I'm naming each of the diamonds. I'm giving them names. The first diamond is named you are not your user. And so the process inside of the first diamond is to break the user up into little bits, take a slice off the flank steak of the user, and figure out how to do that. And then we move into the second diamond, which is called form follows function, and we build a shape that corresponds to what we told ourselves was the truth about the user. And this is a hard thing to let go of, and Dylan here raises an important point. And for us to completely throw away you are not your user, as designers, if we are going to just make stuff, clearly that isn't going to work either. So perhaps rather than discarding you are not your user, maybe it would be better to say, let's definitely discard form follows function, but perhaps rather than discarding this axiom of you are not your user, maybe we should think about the opposite of you are not your user. Just set aside, it's important that we have empathy. It's important that we understand populations and people who are not us. But as the Danish physicist famously observed, sometimes the opposite of a profound truth, such as you are not your user, is also a profound truth. So the mode, what is the opposite of the mode of you are not your user? What is the opposite of the mode of the narrow beam into one square of the grid at a time? The opposite of that is a floodlight. The opposite of parts is wholes, looking at the whole. And Geoffrey West has more graphs, and his first set of graphs made me awfully sad. This second series of graphs gives me hope, because there's another way of doing that we could adopt if we wanted to. If we discarded the axiom of form follows function, if we suspended the truth of you are not your user and looked at sort of what could we be free to do if we could do the opposite? Perhaps we could give ourselves permission to build in the way that nature builds. The way that nature builds is not superlinear scaling, it's sublinear scaling. Each time that nature makes something twice as big, it uses 25% less resources. What this shows are mammals, and when you make a mouse twice as big, the resulting creature uses 25% less energy, 25% slower heartbeat, 25% shorter or longer lifespan, depending how you scale the living world. And unlike that hockey stick that just goes up and up and up forever and then innovate or die, what this pattern describes, because this is the pattern of life, is this pattern has death inherent inside of it, not as a singularity to be avoided, but as an eventuality to be accepted. Sublinear bounded growth of the sort that would be sustainable includes designing for the end of the life of what's been designed, as opposed to the fantasy of eternal life for our products and services. It's the opposite. It's truly the opposite. The things that people make go up and to the right until there's a calamity. The stuff that life makes, the bigger and more complex it gets, the more it conserves. The slower the pace gets. On the other side, up and to the right, the pace gets faster and faster and faster until we freak out. So we could describe this alternate paradigm just like there's a way to talk about the information architecture of the problem we find ourselves in, the mess that we find ourselves in. I'd like to posit what is the information architecture of the opposite paradigm. And I'm basing all of this in the work of an architect called Christopher Alexander. In a work called The Nature of Order, Christopher Alexander says that all space and matter, organic or inorganic, has some degree of life in it. And matter/space is more alive or less alive according to its structure and arrangement. So at the core, value is not a situational it depends. What this says is, and it's not a dualism of the material world is real and neutral and doesn't want to do anything in particular, and then spirit is maybe a fairy tale. This is saying wholeness, spirit, matter, energy, it's all part of the same system. And it can be more or less alive depending on what we do with it. Famous example of modern art, when Duchamp put a urinal in an art exhibition, that was creating meaning. By putting this name R. Mutt on it, creating a fictional character of an artist, situating this in an art gallery, that was applying a whole lot of interesting meaning to something that had different received meanings in the culture. That's not what we're talking about. This is value on the basis of it depends, value that can be superimposed. What Chris Alexander is saying is that anything in the world is more or less alive depending on how it's put together. And that we could look at two instances of anything and make an objective determination of which one was better, which one is more whole and beautiful and alive than the other, because of the way that it's designed, because of the way that this material has been situated in space. One of these is better than the other. And part of that value being inherent in things flows from a cosmology that says that order, this is the opposite of form follows function. This is saying that the basis by which you would make the choices, which of these are you going to do? Doing that choice on the basis of function alone isn't going to get you there, according to Christopher Alexander. His belief is that order, goodness in how you put things together, is prior to function. It certainly includes function. A urinal that does not catch urine, of course, is bad. But there is a more or less good way to go about doing this, is what the philosophy says. This is a picture from a homeless shelter for the homeless mentally ill in San Jose, California, that Chris Alexander built. And while we're talking about bathrooms, some of my other favorite architects very much aligned with this way of thinking. Order is not just on the basis of need and function. For example, this very plain-looking bathroom at this homeless shelter for the mentally ill. You could have made any number of choices about how to put this space together. When I peeked in here, I was immediately struck by the beautiful cascading levels of scale in the way that these rectangles are sort of set up in the room. And the thing that caught me most is the wall that's closest to the door is shorter in height than the wall between the bathroom stall and the shower. In conventional construction, you would never do that. Why wouldn't you make them the same size? Why wouldn't you make it more amenable to Maybe you could pre-make all of the parts and just bring them to the bathroom and assemble them more cheaply, more quickly. And if you were working on the basis of blueprints and plans, which Alexander does not do, it's actually harder to draw and give instructions for two different pieces than two of the same sized pieces. But what Alexander is saying, that even a bathroom for homeless, mentally ill people can be more whole and beautiful and alive through the choices that we make about situating the material in space. So he says, that's what I'm getting at, is the existence of a level of thought or a level of reality where order in space is such a deep phenomenon that it is capable of generating all our activities as architects or as builders. And that function, ornament, and what have you will all come into play as byproducts of that level of observation and thought. This is a picture of the outside of the Julian Street Inn, the homeless shelter for the mentally ill. This building was built, I believe, I'm probably going to get this wrong. Actually, I may have had the date. 1990, so I don't have it wrong. So this was built in 1990. It is built with 4,500 hand-glazed tiles all over this place. It's incredible. And the reason why he did that is because of time. The existence of this building over time and the realization that buildings for homeless people don't get a lot of budget to keep improving them and taking care of them well. Why do the trouble of 4,500 hand-glazed tiles all over this building? Here's a picture of where the residents stay. There's a plumbing fix that is really ugly that's been sort of shoved up in the corner there. They've got the wires for telephones and things stapled onto the ceilings. If you examine this photo, the effects of time on this place are starting to show themselves. But the overwhelming beauty of 4,500 hand-painted glazed tiles over every surface of this place is making it continue to be beautiful even while the effects of time take their effect. It strikes me that time is something that we are in denial of in the way that we make products and services today. Try to figure out the sequence of what shows up in your news feed. Something from 23 hours ago is going to show up next to something from 3 minutes ago. And your ability to know what's going on in this place over time, there's a way of doing which says, well, let's make that something that everybody can understand. That is not how we build today. So the information architecture of this, how we get out of this, we could change the cosmology, the ontology inside of it all, that value is inherent, not something that depends. We could start arranging things on the basis of bounded growth. And then we could use some complementary practices, just like a double diamond of form follows function and you are not your user complements the other sort of the mess that we're in. There are ways of doing that I can share with you that align with this alternate, this opposite paradigm. And the first one is that you and your user are one. Because all space and all material have some degree of life in it, I am made of the same stuff that you are. Alexander's theory says, he says, I believe it is in the nature of matter that all of it is soaked through with self, that what I am is in the things that I make and in my relationships with other people. He likes to talk about what happens to metal filings in the presence of a magnet as an example of this. That space and matter are not neutral, that it wants to come together in ways that are more whole and beautiful and alive if we want them to, if we notice what nature does, for example. So not only are you and your user one, you and your user and the thing that you're making are all made of the same stuff. And further, that this inherent value in everything, if all material is soaked through with self, then we all know how to do it the right way. We all know how to build in this different way already by using the things that we make as a mirror of ourself. So the thing that you are making, when you look at it, how much of you is in the thing that you're making? With each decision about the modality, the form, the function, the beauty, making choices to see more and more of yourself in the thing that you're making. We have this expression in English, when you're embarrassed, when you did something wrong, you say, I couldn't face myself in the mirror. What if we used the things that we make as a mirror of ourselves? And if you made something that wasn't good, that you couldn't face it, that you wouldn't stop working on it until you were satisfied that what you see in that mirror is a person that you could love, that you could be proud of. And lastly, accepting that the things that we make are going to die. There's an American band called the Grateful Dead that I've not really understood until quite recently. There was this beautiful documentary about them called Long Strange Trip. It's a very recent documentary. And this combination of being devoted to making things that are alive, that are whole, and that are beautiful, and knowing that it's time-bound and that they will die, and that that's part of the beauty, I think that is anathema to the way that we practice today. That's telling your boss it's not going to go up and to the right forever, but that this is something that we'd really benefit from considering seriously. Instead of making something that lasts forever, instead of making something that is based on the lie that you can go up and to the right endlessly and just keep innovating and keep innovating, how about making something beautiful and whole and alive, where the point is not eternal life, but the point is when you're looking at what you're making, that's good, and that's a reflection of you. Chris asks, what would it be like to live in a mental world where one's reasons for making something functionally and one's reasons for making something in a certain shape or a certain ornamental way are actually coming from precisely the same place in you? Precisely the same place. This is heresy. This is something we're not supposed to say. That the standard we could give to ourselves in the work that we do is that we had fun when we were doing it, all along the way, not just at the end. Every act of making, I saw myself in it. I was proud of it. I could face myself in the mirror of what I did, and that I could deeply please myself, and that could be how we do what we do. So if you're interested in any of these ideas, there is a stack of books that you can read. You can talk to me in one of the breaks, and I will direct you to some of these. And I'm very grateful for your attention. I've used up 12 more seconds than I was supposed to, so sadly no time for questions, but thank you so much. Thanks, Simon.